My name is Alexia Paget, and this is my Humanities in Your World project. My first example of Humanities in My World is Greek food. This project allowed me to try a new restaurant called the Olive Tree in Hiram, Georgia, and I had a big plate of Greek food, and it was called the Tour of Greece. Obviously, this stems from the classical Greek period, and in my plate I had a gyro with pita bread. I'm not sure what meat it was. Typically, it's supposed to be pork in original Greek entrees, but it can also be lamb, it can be a mixture, just depends on where you get it from. I also had some sort of vinegary potatoes, and I had homemade tzatziki sauce and souvlaki chicken. There were 2 other portions of this meal that I did not catch the name of, but it was all very good. It's most likely that the Greek cuisines came to America via immigration, but the American culture has just adapted this food and just expanded upon it. So, for example, gyros now, you can go to pita and get chicken gyros, and you can get a bunch of different meat options, topping options, side options, but the Greek food and Mediterranean cuisines as a whole has just really transformed all of the different options available in America. My second example of Humanities in My World is the working dog breeds, specifically the Boer Bull and the Rottweiler. The Boer Bull originally originated in South Africa and is a breed stemming from the Mastiff breed. They are actually named after Boers, who are descendants of Dutch colonists who settled in the southernmost tip of Africa in the late 1600s. The original job of this breed was to protect livestock and homestead and even tracking and hunting. The Boer Bull breed eventually came to America in the late 1990s, and the American Kennel Club recognized them in the early 2000s, 2006 to be exact, and they eventually recognized them as a member of the working group in 2015. I also want to point out the Rottweiler, which pretty much has the same job as the Boer Bulls, but they're a descendant of ancient Roman Mastiff type dogs, so a pretty similar group of breed. They were eventually left behind in the 1st century AD in Germany, and the town is now called Rottweil, Germany, which I thought was pretty cool. But the Rottweiler breed eventually came to America in the early 1900s, typically with German immigrants, and they were also recognized by the American Kennel Club in 1931, so a bit earlier. There's no exact time of when these breeds were domesticated in America, but obviously they've become pets, with Rottweilers being a lot more prominent than the Boer Bull breed. I've actually only met one Boer Bull, which is in this picture, and both of these pictures were taken at my job. I work at a boarding facility with a bunch of dogs, so they were taken. One was in my car and the other one was inside the building. My third example is the game of bowling. So technically the game of bowling, the closest to the modern day bowling that we know, was called nine pins, and it originated in 300 AD in Germany as a religious ceremony. And it was cool because Martin Luther actually decided that there would be 9 pins to roll at. There was a really primitive game called Stones at Pins that was found in ancient Egypt and in tombs as early as 5200 BC. Once 9 pins was established, it was spread throughout Europe, and the American Bowling Congress established in 1980. And then professional leagues such as PBA, they were then founded in 1958. Obviously, bowling has become a huge hit throughout the US and the world as a whole, but specifically the US, and there are many of teams that you can play on competitively or just for fun. So it's become a very, very popular game that would have stemmed from German culture. But it's really cool to think about the origin of bowling and how there were so many different games that were similar that it eventually just became bowling. When I was researching the game, I found a really interesting fact that in medieval Europe, the game was actually banned because the soldiers were focusing on playing bowling instead of focusing on training and everything that they needed to be an actual military. So I just thought that was a really funny fact. My next example is concrete statues and sculptures. This ancient form of art can date back to the Stone Age, ancient Egypt, ancient Rome. Ancient Romans were really the best to do any sort of stone art just because they perfected the concrete aspect. But I did find this statue in Dallas, Georgia, and it is made for Lafayette Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he was a justice of the peace, a deputy sheriff, state legislature for 4 years. He was a judge, a chairman of the board of trustees in Dallas. He really did a lot, and I think it's cool that even in the 1900s, we were making stone sculptures. This was really a big innovation for the entire world because it really changed the work of art, and it allowed a lot of artists, even Michelangelo, to become very creative and really leave their mark in a permanent way. It's really interesting to see how strong and built to last these statues were made to be, because obviously they're stone, but they have lasted for so many years. For example, this statue in particular was built in the 1900s, so to withstand so much just natural weather inclements and erosion is really cool to see. My next example is the Gothic style architecture. This form of architecture was really brought about in the mid-12th century and really hit its peak in the late 1500s, the late 15th century and the early 16th century. This form of architecture stems from the Romanesque architecture type, and it really transformed into the Gothic revival of the 18th and 19th centuries. The Gothic architecture style was originally in France, and it later stemmed all throughout Europe. This architectural style really became the transition from the Middle Ages to the early modern architecture style. This sort of architecture is most prominent in churches and cathedrals, and I think it's really cool to still see churches and cathedrals being built in this architecture style, especially in America where it didn't even stem from. And I think that it's really pretty, and I didn't really realize how many churches shared this architecture style. Obviously not all of them do, but after learning about this, I really started to see it in my day-to-day life, and I thought that was pretty awesome. My next example is welded sculptures. This art style really came about in the early 20th century. During my research, I found that Vladimir Tatlin was the first to really create welded sculptures, and his first being in 1913. He started this new form of art during the Russian constructivist movement, and it really advanced throughout the World War I time period, which gave artists a whole bunch of new tools and creative outlets to use during this time. Pablo Picasso also created welded sculptures, which I thought was really interesting. Because of his influence, Picasso really set the bar for welded sculptures and really got the ball moving in the late 1920s and the early 1930s. This is really interesting because it really shows that welds aren't only used in architecture but also in art, and there's a whole lot of sculptures that are made from welded metals. My next example is of murals in America. I spent a day in Atlanta and I came across this mural titled Our City, and it was originally created by the Private Industry Council of 1993, but it was restored in 2002 by Mahdi and students from the Ann Harbor Project. This mural is consisted of mosaic tiles, and it has a similar Arab script written upon it. This mural is located on Ponce de Leon Avenue Beltline, and it's on the East Side Trail Bridge underpass. This actually used to be a railroad bridge in the city. The act of murals was actually brought to the Americas, specifically California, in the 1920s. The Mexican muralism movement specifically really heavily impacted the prominence of murals in the Americas. During the Great Depression is when people started being able to be commissioned for murals, which I thought was really interesting because it allowed for income in such a devastating time for the country. Since then, murals have just taken a life of its own. In fact, if you walk through the city of Atlanta, there are so many murals on each corner, each bridge, just everywhere, along with graffiti, but specifically the beautiful works of art that surround the city is really amazing to see. They don't always have a backstory such as this one, and some of them are very colorful, some of them are a bit more realistic. It's just a really amazing culture in any big city. My next example is concrete bridges. So concrete bridges actually date back to ancient Rome, and as I said before, the Romans really did concrete well. They were the first to start implementing volcanic ash to make concrete, which made it slow drying and strong, and they added pozzolana, which was the binder, and they were the first to discover that pouring concrete in underwater harbor structures actually made them a whole lot stronger. Concrete is obviously used all around the world, and it's so prominent in our roadways, our architecture, just everything that we see in our day-to-day life. But our modern version of concrete is actually only made stronger due to the metal rods that are put into the concrete. I think it's really interesting to see how the ancient Romans were able to create such strong material when they didn't have any influence coming to them to make any of this better, whereas obviously we learned from the ancient Romans and we've just built upon that. Our modern day world really takes humanities from all different cultures and countries, but I think that the ancient Romans really brought us a whole lot to build upon in our modern day world, and I think it's really cool that they were the trendsetters of this new society. My next example is novels. The oldest form of novels is just plain storytelling. The art of creating novels really stems from the English 18th century, but it has a lot of precursors for novels as we know them today. For example, the modern day novels really take inspiration from medieval romances, and the Don Quixote is a crucial precursor to the modern novel because it exemplifies social commentary, diverse characters, focus on realistic portrayal as society. I do think there's a lot to be said about plays. Although they aren't actually written stories, they are being acted out. I think that Shakespeare had a ginormous influence on modern day writing and novels for any sort of entertainment. Specifically, I think that Romeo and Juliet is just one of the biggest influences on romance novels, which was written in 1595 or 1596. They don't have an exact date, but somewhere in that time period. Ancient forms of novels, storytelling, and plays, they all play such a big role on our modern day novels, and I don't think literature would look anywhere similar to how it looks now if it weren't for all of those pivotal works of art. Aside from just reading for entertainment, we obviously use a lot of works of literature in schools to teach students. We also have public libraries that would have nothing if it weren't for all of these, everything that led up to modern day literature. This picture is actually from my own mini library. I really like to read, so I was very excited to add this into my project. From a more modern stance, I think that a lot of classic works of art such as Pride and Prejudice, 1984, To Kill a Mockingbird, all of those have also really transformed the way that authors write books, and I think that's really interesting. Although I haven't read many of the classics, I just know that they were a huge factor in creating any sort of novel that we read nowadays. My last example is of vinyl pressings. I think the entire journey of music is very, very interesting, from the Gregorian chant to all of the other steps that it took to get to your classical Beethoven and just classical music in general, which then stemmed to jazz and blues, and it went through so many more steps before it got to the modern day music that plays on the radio today. The first tangible form of music media was the vinyl pressing, which first only pressed classical vinyls and classical music, and then it stemmed to the more popular genres such as jazz and blues. But the first vinyl pressing was in 1948 by Columbia Records. For the sake of my picture and my example, it's actually pivotal to know that the first rap vinyl pressing was not until 1979, so 31 years later, which I think is really interesting. Of course, we do have other hard, tangible medias of music such as CDs and cassette tapes. I think the first vinyl pressing was actually super, super important to the tangible form of media. Of course, now we have the radio station and we have digital forms of media such as Spotify and Apple Music, but I think it's really cool that we are still pressing vinyl records today. Similar to books, there's a lot of people that collect these forms of media, even though it's not as easily accessible as clicking a few buttons on your phone. But I think there's something really cool about being able to just put a record on and letting the needle do its work, and just being able to hear the different music in a different way other than through headphones, I suppose. That concludes my humanities project. I had a lot of fun with this project, and I only wish that we had a full semester to actually go out and get the different examples, because I would love to see what else my city holds as our humanities that we see in our day-to-day life.